He cooked in our kitchen. I posted my scariest experience yesterday, but my husband and I had quite a few freaky incidences where we used to live. A small town in North Carolina, and one particularly creepy one near our new place in Texas. This is one from North Carolina. It didn't scare me as much then as it should have until it was too late. We never felt safe living there again, but had to for 3 more years. We lived in an old barn that had been renovated into 2 apartments, split right down the middle. Both sides had 2 floors and a basement. It had a pond down the hill behind it, and a huge field stretched out in place of a front yard. Right smack dab in the middle of the field was a junk pile. Old rusty trash cans, tools, just junk. It also had the remains of an old doghouse our neighbor had built, then set out there to rot when the dog died. Important later. So, we had neighbors on the other side of the barn duplex. Very sweet older couple. They had a garden right around the corner of the house where the wife would spend her day while her husband was at work. They mentioned one day that food had started disappearing from the kitchen. I thought I was losing my mind until an entire loaf of bread disappeared. They chalked it up to their delinquent daughter stopping in without telling them and shopping as she'd done it before. Months went by, and every now and again, she'd mention something about her daughter had stolen canned food, prepared meals from the fridge, a couple of pots and pans, some toilet paper, so on and so on. They never reported it because they didn't want their daughter to be in trouble. They just thought the whole thing was sad. Weird stuff started happening around the house. We found the remnants of a campfire by the pond one day, and a bar of Irish Spring soap floating in the water. One day, I looked out the window towards a pond and saw what I thought was a person standing near the water. Scared the hell out of me, and I pointed it out to my husband. The longer we looked, we realized it was actually an item of clothing hanging from a tree, maybe to dry? We were too spooked to go and look, and it was gone the next day. Here is where it gets super scary. We started missing food. It only happened twice, but the second time we had gone on the rather long walk up our driveway to the mailbox. We left the door unlocked, and when we got back, the ingredients for grilled cheese were on the kitchen counter, and there was a hot pan still on the stove. We called 911 and did a search of the yard. They didn't look in the field because it was just so wide open, with just the junk pile in the middle. Finally, one day, our neighbor left her door open for 5 minutes and went to the garden right by the house. In that time, her purse was stolen from the living room. No cars had pulled up, so someone had been watching her and took the opportunity. She called the police, and the next day they did another search. This time, they went to the field and realized there was the old makeshift doghouse. Inside, there was a bed made of old blankets, food wrappers in a neat pile, 2 beers, rolls of toilet paper, our neighbor's missing pans, heroin paraphernalia, and the sweet lady's missing purse. Everything out of it and stuffed with leaves to use as a pillow. There had been a heroin addict living on our property for months, stealing from us, bathing in the pond and watching us for the best opportunity to do so. He never stole anything of value except the purse, so I think he intended to be there for a long time. I guess when he came back and saw his house empty, he just never came back. Alone with a killer. When I was about 13 years old, my parents and I moved to an old house. It was at least 90 years old. It was large and it was in pretty good condition for a house that old. I was an only child. I got the second biggest room on the second floor, and that room was huge. Sometimes, my parents left me at home by myself for a few hours, whether they were going shopping or on a date. I always asked to stay at home. I didn't mind staying at home because I like to think of myself as responsible and trustworthy. It made me feel special. One night, at around 6 p.m. or so, my parents had to go run some errands. They were the kind of people who spent long hours out shopping for the best deals, and they used a lot of coupons on whenever they could. And I did not want to be involved in this at all, so I decided not to come. I stayed in my room and watched some TV. Then, at around 8 p.m., I got hungry and decided to get a snack. Now at this point, the house is very dark, so I grabbed my cell phone and used it as best as I can to light up the hallway, since the hallway did not have a light. Now, this was before cell phones had built-in flashlights, so I just used all the light my screen could give until I made it to the kitchen. The kitchen light had been left on by my parents. I put my phone on the counter. As I was walking to the pantry, I saw a man hunched down in the corner by the back door. He was wearing black and red clothing. He had long, greasy, unkempt hair. I didn't see his face because his head was facing the wall. He was holding a large knife. He didn't notice that I had spotted him. I wanted to scream, but I used my hand to cover my mouth and walked back upstairs, leaving my cell phone down there. I was not walking over to get it. We didn't have any phones upstairs, so I walked into my room, locked the door, and I hid in my closet. I started crying silently and started thinking the worst. He was going to find me and kill me. I just knew it. Then, I heard someone coming up the stairs. Heavy footsteps. I felt sick, and I had never been so scared in my life. Then, I heard someone open the door to my parents' room, which was 2 rooms away from mine. I then hear police sirens outside, and I hear the door being knocked on. I breathe a sigh of relief. I hear the man running back down the stairs quickly, and he's trying to open our back door. Then I hear our front door being pushed down, and I hear footsteps of 2 people coming upstairs, and they start searching our home. The police come to my room and let me know it's safe. I open the door. I later found out that our neighbor saw this man unlocking our back door with a key and saw that he had a knife and called the police. My parents arrived a few minutes later and my mom started hugging me and crying. The man unfortunately escaped. I cried and cried and cried. And that night, I got no sleep at all because the man had a key. We changed the lock, but we eventually moved way out of state. I'm 23 years old now. I have moved past it for sure. But there are several questions I still have. How did he get a key? Why did he want to come to our house? And what would he have done if the police showed up any later? In my kitchen. I posted an encounter story a little while back. I have another story to share, this time it pertains to me. Until I was 18, I grew up on a reservation. My res, so to say, is pretty populated. The houses are all spread out, and it's common for a neighbor to be on average around 500 meters minimum. There's a lot of various types around, but that was never an issue until this one night. I lived with my mom's, my dad, older sister, and younger brother, who at the time was a newborn. I was about 5 or 6 at the time. We lived in a really shabby house at the time, but my dad being a tough old biker type, we generally had no issues with safety. We frequently left doors unlocked and open, notably the front door, so we could have cool airflow in the house at night. So anyways, on a rainy Saturday night, it was the summer, I couldn't sleep due to the humidity outside. I got out of bed and figured a trip to the bathroom would buy me some time before I got yelled at to go back to sleep. I roamed out of my door down the hallway, past my parents' bedroom and into the kitchen. The bathroom was right by the kitchen, so at some point I thought it wouldn't hurt if I got a drink. I remember standing in the kitchen in front of the fridge. I got out some juice and was about to take a drink. Then it happened. Within a span of maybe 10 seconds, a man appears at my front door. I was facing the fridge. He was about 20 meters to my left. He stands there, mouth breathing, and rips open my front door. He glares at me and starts yelling out, "Hey you," and come here." Then, this dude steps into my kitchen and makes a beeline for me. I stood there frozen in horror and couldn't even whimper out to help or anything. Like a superhero, my dad flies in and tackles the dude from the side. The man and my dad struggle for a bit, but then my dad throws this dude outside, all while yelling at him. My dad is yelling is what startled me out of my daze. I start crying, and my dad had to comfort me. He let me grab juice and a couple cookies and sent me back to bed. I learned a few years later that the dude was known to my dad. He was at a party at my neighbor's who loved to party. It didn't matter weekend or weekday, and somehow wandered off. During his walk off, he got lost and for some reason mistook my house for my neighbor's and tried to get in. Dad had woken up and on some gut instinct decided to go towards the kitchen. He said the banging on the door had alerted him, and he walked in just in time to grab the dude. Even after asking so many times, my dad still exclaims, "It was all instinctual." However, this doesn't explain why the man reached out towards me and tried to grab me. I guess I'll never know. Sweet girl. This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old, and my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts, and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience, which was a lot of fun, honestly. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There was a big group of us visiting. Me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beachside house for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach. The house was really big too. To this day, it's the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyways, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, and did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, and it's so deeply ingrained in my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of the younger kids. They weren't going to be gone long. They said they would come back at 10 o'clock at the very latest, and the house had a security system installed, so no one was really worried about anything happening. Plus, it was the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us, 2 boys, 11 and 15 years old, and 1 girl, 15 years old. I was rooming with my female cousin, and the boys were rooming together, while the adults had their own private rooms. So, I was the youngest by a long shot. Anyways, us kids decided to go to the beach while the sun was still out, an hour or 2 max. We packed up our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view. We didn't stray too far away. We were basically just in the backyard. My female cousin Joanna didn't let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. So, the older boys swam out and did their thing while Joanna, Eric, who was 11, and I stayed behind and played on the beach. Our plans of staying out for only a couple hours turned into 3. It was only as the water became a little too aggressive that we decided to go back inside the house. Because my brother's an idiot, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house, which required walking all the way around the gate and down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, the 5 of us. It was pretty dark at this point. Joanna and I held hands the entire way. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear and my older cousin Dean took the lead in front. We kept quiet while we were walking back, all of us tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there. I was so tired. I had no idea what they were saying, and I didn't care. My only concern was sleep and Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized something was wrong. there was a man walking towards us from the other side of the dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I can remember the look on this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian, very tan, and adorned in typical male tourist attire consisting of a tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, and a straw hat. His clothes were straight out of a tropical getaway catalog. There were other houses in the area as well, being rented out by people, so we all just figured he was in a neighboring property, walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric, and I just in case, and slowed at the same time the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie and said he was lost, looking for directions to the house where he was staying at. He appeared to be under the influence, kinda glassy-eyed and wobbly. He couldn't stand perfectly still. There was some swaying, and for whatever reason, his eyes went directly to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell that she was nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed there was something seriously wrong with the way this man was looking at her. Eric, who was up at this point, had ignored me the whole trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the older boys, took my other hand, and the three of us stood together like a shaky wall behind Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words that were being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back to the left and whatnot. This lasted maybe 5 minutes before we were finally able to be on our way. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall, and then he waved by and we all carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged a look with each other, but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all. We'd entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how much fun the beach was. And then we heard a knock on the front door. Expecting our parents, we didn't really think anything of it. The older kids were too lazy to go up and answer it, but Dean eventually caved. He went to the door, and I, being a curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door where Dean could have looked, but he didn't. He unlocked the door and opened it, his body language turning rigid as he met eyes with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense, and he glanced back, motioning for me to go away and grab my brother. I waited a couple seconds before doing it, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could use the phone in the house. Apparently, he was too far away, and the long walk was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up on someone's doorstep, asking to use their phone, wasn't terribly out of the ordinary. I skittered off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look in my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went to the door. Like Dean, his body went rigid when he saw Eddie. The three of them spoke at the door for a long time. Eddie was begging to use the phone, while Dean and my brother said they couldn't let him inside. They asked if he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults come home and ask them instead. By telling him this, however, they had let slip the fact that us kids were home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes. By this time, Joanna came up to see what was happening. I remember she rocked back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced down at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. I usually wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he used to get scared really easily. To this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and things. For this reason, he swallowed a dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner to see that my brother had let Eddie inside the house. standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the wall in the long hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the front door open after, standing there and watching for a solid 20 minutes or so until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away in the back seat. Our parents came home maybe 10 minutes after, a car full of groceries in the trunk. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew we let a stranger inside to use the phone, they would have blown their shit. Rightfully, but still, we were kids and my brother tried to sort the situation out as best as he could. Plus, Eddie didn't do anything per se. There was just something off about him, though. Something was just odd. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie. At least I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a huge kitchen knife under her pillow just in case. I had no idea at the time. She told me this years later. On the 4th night at this house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside, and we had a little cookout in the back. It was a really good time. There was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a little bit of storytelling from my slightly inebriated uncle, aka Dean and Eric's father. My parents told me I could stay up late with everyone and everything, which I hadn't been allowed to do so the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice to say, we were all having a good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the hell out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent, and didn't return until a couple of minutes after. She went straight to my father after, without the repellent, and whispered something to him, a worried look on her face. The others noticed, eventually asking what was going on. She told me some strange man was at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and sober uncle, Joanna's father, went over to check what all the fuss was about. They answered the door, asked Eddie what he wanted, who, to my memory, kept saying, "My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my buddy?" Will is my brother's name. I remember thinking it was weird, the fact that he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very weird, too. My father asked Eddie what he wanted, and why he wanted to talk to my brother. Eddie just kept saying Will was his buddy, and that he wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something, drugs, alcohol, I don't know. There was something wrong with him. Eventually, Eddie said he needed to use the phone again, and that Will had let him use it last time. The jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came up to see what was going on and gave him the death look. He knew better than to let strangers in the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but at the same time kind of disarming. You didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. My father and uncle told Eddie he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store, where he could ask for directions, find proper help, etc. Eddie tried to persuade them into letting him use our phone, but they firmly told him he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately after. Sometime later, we all went to bed. Joanna and I stayed up a little later, and she read me a chapter of the YA novel she had been reading the whole trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what half of it meant anyways. Plus, it was only the beginning. None of the crazy-ass hard hair, resisting flesh, sleeping man stuff that went on later. In any case, I fell asleep, and a few hours later, I woke up to the sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake, and said we had to hide in the bathroom for a bit. The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear, and without her telling me directly, I knew this was about Eddie. She took me by the hand, and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed she kept touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out she had tucked the knife in there, and felt for it every few seconds to make sure she still had it. We had hid for about an hour until we heard the police. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house, and I remember Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it then, but apparently, Eddie had come to the house again while we were sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the three of them had left the window open. Apparently, Eddie hovered by the window a second and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor thing, was the first one who saw him and screamed bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were bloodshot, and he was twitching all over the place, climbing in and asking his buddy to help him find the sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose, and he began laughing, shouting, and telling my brother they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things, all at the same time. It's like he couldn't decide if he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him other than the fact that he had broken into the house. The way he was talking, he was so delusional, as though he was really convinced that Will was really his buddy, and Joanna was really going to be his that night. It was apparently terrifying. To this day, my brother doesn't talk about it. He's the only one who refuses to recount his full version of the story. I think it has something to do with Eddie really truly thinking they were old buds, who had promised each other they would use Joanna like a rag doll. The man was so convinced. Anyways, their screaming woke up the adults, and my mother called the police right away, while my father and my two uncles held Eddie down until the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke the girl up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We had no idea if Eddie had come alone, but we were pretty convinced. My mother checked if the other windows and doors were closed and locked, and then she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops drove up. Turns out, Eddie had some mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna after he first saw her. She was exactly his type, young, of color, and unwilling. Oh, and later we found out Joanna wasn't the only girl he had harassed on his trip, but she was the only one whose house he had snuck into in search of her. Who knows what would have happened if he climbed through our window instead of the boys. Eddie, let's not meet again, buddy.